There's no doubt that one of the reasons he is staying in F1 is that he wants an 8th World Championship.
Do you give yourself some leeway in a year, 2 years from now to sign somebody, like a Lando or something like that to come into that team?
When we're talking about rookies and 7 races in, whether they should be out of the sport, I think you have to look a little bit at what your expectations are of a rookie going into Formula One.
Think of him in a full, hot, passionate Ferrari red get-up.
I did wonder where you were going there with that, Cage, for a moment. But yeah, kind of.
Thought we were getting some fanfic kind of thing or something.
Welcome to Unlapped. We got a lot to get into today. Katie George, Nate Saunders, Laurence Edmondson. Good to be back with both of you. Nate and I were on ESPN's post-race F1 show. So Laurence, we haven't caught up with you in quite a while because you've been busy. You were at the Spanish Grand Prix, and then you were at Chris Medland's Stag, which aka in the States is a bachelor party, correct?
That's right. I mean, I love the Spanish Grand Prix so much. We thought we'd extend it further and celebrate Chris Medland getting married in a couple of months. Yeah, so it's been a fun week or so. If I'm stumbling and struggling to come up with my words today, you know why. But yeah, it was good. I don't think I can say anything more than that. Usually what happens on a stag do stays on the stag do, right?
And now it sounds like I boycotted it. Now it sounds like I wasn't there I just couldn't make it, sadly. So if Chris Medland's listening to this, which I know he does sometimes, we're going to do a part 2 at some point. He knows that already, but he doesn't know where.
Okay, so you're going to plan a second portion. My goodness.
Plans
I fear for both your livers.
Plans in motion, yeah. I mean, livers at this point, they are what they are. When you get to this age, you just, they're all over the place.
So I know Nate's thoughts, obviously, on what went down in Spain. But Laurence, I just like to get your initial thoughts, takeaways from the weekend on the whole, and obviously the comeback that Mercedes clearly put on track.
Yeah, the Mercedes was the main talking point coming out of it, wasn't it? Because they emerged comfortably as the second fastest team behind Red Bull. I think what we shouldn't lose sight of is that Red Bull are still a long way ahead, 24 seconds at the end of the race. Toto Wolff was saying that maybe if Lewis had pushed harder, they could have got that down to about 15 seconds. But even so, who knows what Max had in reserve anyway. And Red Bull's strategy was very conservative because they knew they were going to blow the field away. So as exciting as it is to see Mercedes make progress, and I think it shows that they've found a better route with the development of their car than they had before. They're still a long way off. And also they're retrofitting all these new developments and upgrades onto a chassis, which was kind of built around a different concept in the first place. And there's elements of that they just cannot change until next year. So really the best that Mercedes can hope for in this is that they emerge as the second best team throughout the remainder of this year, but they're up against stiff competition, especially in Aston Martin in the start they've made this year. And then everything that they learned from this season, they can build into next year. But you got to remember, Red Bull are just not standing still. And that's the thing that is hard to get head around. So main takeaway was that, yes, Mercedes have made a step forward, but one, I think it could be very track specific. That was a track that was always going to suit the characteristics of the Mercedes car. And then the other takeaway is that Red Bull on a circuit, which people often look to as one of the main aero circuits on the calendar, were just miles ahead again. Plus, of course, we had Sergio Perez showing that perhaps, any chance of a title battle is very, very optimistic given another mistake he made in qualifying.
Nate, anything you want to add to put a bow on Spain?
No, Laurence covered it in depressingly accurate detail about how one-sided the championship is going to be for the time being. But I think that those were the two things. Mercedes and Perez just, in the space of 3 weeks, he's basically gone from, potential title contender to a guy that's probably going to finish a distant second, which is a bit of a blow at this point.
All right, well, let's go ahead and dive into the headlines. Some news coming out of Spain was that Lewis Hamilton, after the race, was going to sit down with Toto Wolff, team principal at Mercedes, and discuss his contract extension. He hasn't signed anything yet. That was, of course, on the weekend. We would have obviously heard something at this point had he. So where are we with the contract and what can we expect moving forward?
Well, these contract talks have been going on for several months now, so this was just another step along the way. I talked to both Toto and Lewis in Azerbaijan. And at that point, we already knew the contract talks are underway. And at that point, they both sounded very keen to get them done. There was just some difficulty when it comes to talking about money, obviously. And then the other thing we don't know at this stage is how long this contract is going to be. In some ways, it may make sense just to do a single year and see where things stand. But everything from Lewis's side so far has suggested that he wants to commit to more than a single year. So you're probably looking at 2 years plus a option for a third year. And I guess that's also part of the conversation. We don't know exactly how many details have been decided. We don't know exactly what happened on Monday. Clearly, there was a plan for them to talk because they both mentioned that they wanted to sit down then. Toto said to Sky Sports that it could all be done within half an hour over coffee, which suggests it really is just dotting I's and crossing T's. But until we get that final confirmation from Mercedes, we kind of got to assume that the negotiations are still going on to some extent. This whole process of getting a contract together, especially between Lewis and Mercedes, is an interesting one because they've done it so many times before. They often say that a lot of the details of the contract have just remained the same from the very first one he signed in 2013. Then they modify stuff as they go. There'll be things like partner days, deciding on how much of Lewis's time gets given away to basically help fund the Mercedes F1 team and stuff like that. And then, of course, he has his charitable organizations. There's Mission 44, which Mercedes have contributed to, and then there's Ignite, which both Lewis and Mercedes have contributed to, again trying to increase diversity in motorsport. So there's a lot to consider, but I suspect probably the biggest issue for them to consider is the number at the end of it, the number that he gets paid and for how long. And then once that is decided, it will have to go through lawyers and all of that kind of stuff. So even if they shook hands on a deal on Monday, it might not be several weeks until we get the final confirmation, just because these things, need to be triple, quadruple checked along the way to make sure everyone is happy and no one can get out of what they've signed.
I think you should get drunk more often. You're firing on all cylinders right now. Is he not, Nate?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I might as well not be here.
He's making up for ditching us last week by it just being the two-man show. I'm curious, since Lewis and Toto have done this before, they've gone to the table multiple times. Timeline comparison, is this taking longer than what it has in years past, Nate?
I'm not sure. It's hard to say like for like, but I mean, if you think about after 2021, after everything that happened in Abu Dhabi, we really weren't sure if Lewis was going to actually come back and race. He went out of that season, out of that race, out of contract, on December 31st, 2021. And I forget now exactly the amount of time, but it felt like that dragged on. And obviously that was over the winter. So we didn't have race to talk about it. But it just felt like there was this huge period of time where Lewis hadn't signed. This one feels longer, but I think at the same time, it really does speak to the trust that both sides have in each other. I think that they're really at no point, even though there was that Ferrari rumor, which Lewis kind of, just kind of dismissed out of hand. Ferrari themselves even were like, look, there's nothing to that. You really get a sense that these two people really trust each other. They know that they're not kind of, one of them's trying to negotiate with somebody else behind their back while they're doing it. And I think that when you have that confidence in each other, the time doesn't matter because the end goal is going to, the end result is going to be the same. But yeah, it certainly feels like the longest one, but this is a trend. They've never really been done really, really quickly. The first wind of a new contract, and then when the contract is signed, there's usually quite a bit of time between them. And I think if you're Toto as well, to add, I think Laurence covered it all perfectly, but there's an interesting thing. The interesting thing is the time thing, I think, as well, because if you're Toto, he had such a great succession plan with Bottas, getting Russell into the seat. And that was, years and years of kind of 1 year deals for Bottas, and they knew Russell was there. There's no obvious young candidate currently who could replace Lewis. And I think that part of Toto's head is going to be like, well, do you give yourself some leeway in a year, 2 years from now to sign somebody, like a Lando or something like that to come into that team? Whereas if you're Lewis, you might say, well, look, I want a really long deal here. I'm not sure if he does or not, but that might have kind of changed the dynamic a little bit as well. But yeah, there's lots of things going on. And I think, to be honest with you, it's just, yeah, it does seem like it's just a matter of time. And Mercedes, we've always said, haven't we, have the strongest driver lineup right now in Formula One. And I don't think there's ever been any desire to change that going forward.
Laurence, what would surprise you more if this deal was done by the Canadian Grand Prix or by summer break?
Probably by the Canadian Grand Prix, actually, because I don't think there's a huge amount of rush on either side. I mean, I wouldn't be that surprised if that happens, but Yeah, if it goes beyond the summer break, then I think maybe we do start to ask questions, because they've just been so confident about it at this stage that it's going to happen. It's just a matter of time. So, yeah, I'd be surprised if it goes that long. I think, as Nate mentioned, wasn't it 2021 where he signed just before preseason testing, and that was just a single year deal, and at that point there were lots of questions around it. So I don't think it's that unusual that we've got to this stage midway through the season, and or we're not even at midway through the season, so it's only a third of the way through the season, and there's no deal for the following year. That's not that unusual. I think the interest just comes because it's Lewis, so he's such a high profile Formula One driver, and then secondly that he's coming towards the end of his career, and pretty much every time he's signed a contract, when we've had a press conference afterwards, it's like, will this be the last contract of your career? What's your plans long term, and all this kind of stuff. And yet here we are again talking about what he seems to want as a multiple year contract. So it is interesting, but he's said so many times recently that he sees no reason to end his career at the moment. Certainly from a physical point of view, he thinks he's good enough to match the very best in Formula One. I think you only have to look as far as Fernando, who's 3 years older than Lewis, I think, maybe 2 years older than Lewis, and he's clearly still performing at a high level at 41 years old. So I think Lewis will look to that and be very comfortable about the idea of racing up to about 41, 42, maybe even further. But of course, the other side to this, the key thing which we haven't really discussed, is just that Mercedes do make the progress that Hamilton wants. There's no doubt that one of the reasons he is staying in F1 is that he wants an 8th world championship. And so if Mercedes are unable to construct a car, or show signs that they construct a car to compete with Red Bull over the coming years, then you have to question why Lewis is staying longer. But clearly he feels confident in that. He loves that team and has a relationship with that team, unlike I think any relationship we've seen between team and driver in Formula One for decades. Maybe Michael Schumacher Ferrari was close, but even that ended in a slightly strange situation. So yeah, it's I think it's a case of it all getting done fairly soon, but I'd be surprised if it goes beyond summer.
Okay. Well, we will patiently await that news, as we're 7 races already into the 2023 F1 season. I don't want to say that we're going to stir up drama with this next question, but I'm just curious, based on the season so far, who do you think's at most risk for losing their seat either before the end of 2023 or heading into the 2024 season based on performance thus far?
I think if you were to look at it objectively so far, 2 of the 3 rookies really stand out. Logan Sargent, Nick De Vries, for very different reasons. I think I'd be surprised if Sargent lost his seat this year, but De Vries, there's been a lot of chatter around him losing his seat. Now, I don't know how accurate those reports were in terms of, it seems like the Daniel Ricciardo part of those reports wasn't true, but I think there is internal pressure on De Vries. He came in with a lot of hype, a lot of expectation, and really is being shown up by Yuki Tsunoda at the moment. And we know how unforgiving Red Bull can be. Mm-hmm. So I think De Vries is just kind of an open question mark. Red Bull have Liam Lawson, who's currently racing in Japan, I think, in Super Formula. And there's always been a suggestion they might give him a chance at some point. On the Sargent side, he came in probably a year too early from Formula 3. That was kind of the rap on him. And I just don't think we've seen from Logan that he's kind of really ready for Formula 1. He had that great first lap. He basically had the best first lap a rookie's had for a long time when he kind of, raced through. There was that great onboard of him. But he just doesn't seem to have, what you need in Formula 1. He's made a lot of mistakes. And again, you're always compared to your teammate, and he's looking bad compared to Albon. And I think, we touched on this, didn't we, in the digital show, Katie, that one of the things that Sargent has going for him that I don't think he's lent into is the fact that he's an American driver at a time when Formula 1 has never been more popular in America. He hasn't really embraced that. And we've talked about it before. I'm not comparing Ricciardo and Sargent personality-wise, because they're very different ages, but also they're just very different kind of personalities. But when Ricciardo was struggling at McLaren last year, especially, I think I felt it, and I think Lawrence agreed as well at the time, that because people feel a certain way about Daniel Ricciardo, I think he got an easier run than he would have done than, say, if Lance Stroll. Look at Lance Stroll. He's had 4 or 5 bad or not great performances, and people are already saying he's holding that team back. They've got to get rid of him, blah, blah, blah. It's because people have a certain opinion of Lance Stroll. Ricciardo, even at the end of last year, he had one moderately good performance in Mexico, and everyone was saying, look, he's still as good as ever. And it was like, well, it was okay. It was one good result in a really bad season. And I think Sargent just really hasn't done, especially as a rookie, you've got to kind of come in and make yourself marketable, make yourself kind of an addition to the grid that people want to see. And I don't think he's done that. And I think that if that's happening and you're not performing at the same time, then I think you're in trouble. And I don't know how, I mean, from a marketing point of view, Williams might look at it and say, this guy's great for us, but I'm not convinced it is the case. So unless we see a big turnaround from him, sadly, top of my list would be Sargent and then De Vries just below him.
Well said. I think if you're not adding value currently based on your drives, you have to be adding value from a marketability standpoint. And he's, as you said, not tapping into the American market as he should. He could be capitalizing and winning big here. And I don't feel that here so far this season.
And I totally get it from a point of view of, when you're a rookie, I imagine there's a lot, you want to focus on the racing, but at the same time, he came in at such a point when it just felt like he kind of fumbled the bag at the 1 yard line, as they say. You've got this great opportunity to be America's F1 driver. There was this huge push around Colton Herta. And the reason people in IndyCar love Colton Herta is because he's kind of, when you see him interviewed, he's kind of, he's an entertaining character. His results aren't always amazing, but he's a really entertaining character. Or you look at someone like IndyCar has this driver called Connor Daly, who I don't think's particularly good. I don't think he's ever won an IndyCar race, but people adore him. He's a really, he's got this huge fan base based on the fact that he's just likable, and that means sponsors like him, and the fact fans like him means they buy his merch and stuff like that. Very, very simple, but it keeps you around. I mean, those are maybe clumsy comparisons, IndyCar to Formula One, but I think Sargent really, has kind of missed a big opportunity there.
Laurence, would you agree with those two picks?
Well, I think I'd start by saying I think this is actually the strongest field of drivers we've had for years and years in Formula One. And this is a bit anecdotal, but the last two races, Monaco and Spain, we didn't even have a safety car, yellow flag. And that does speak to the standards of driving at the moment. So actually, if we look at drivers who have deserved to be booted out of F1 in the history of F1 and the drivers we have now, I think you've got 20 drivers who are actually doing a pretty good job. And when we're talking about rookies and 7 races in, whether they should be out of the sport, I think you have to look a little bit what your expectations are of a rookie going into Formula One. It should be a really hard level of performance to be putting out week after week. There should be the possibility of mistakes. It should be that difficult, Formula One. That's, that is the very nature of it. But if you look at who Sargent replaced, Nicholas Latifi, and his performances so far, and okay, he's made mistakes, there's no doubt about it, but I think the overall potential of Sargent is far higher than it was at any point with Nicholas Latifi in the car. So, I actually think that it would be pretty harsh if any of the 20 drivers got booted midway through the season, because I don't think any of them are doing or showing signs that they're going to be doing that bad a job by the end of it. You got to remember as well, these cars are not easy to drive. This new generation of F1 cars are run incredibly stiff, incredibly low to the ground. And that does induce errors even among some of the top drivers. We saw Lewis crash during a practice session in Monaco. We saw Checo Perez crash at the first corner in qualifying. And so, to see the rookies make some mistakes as well on the way, it's not perhaps that surprising. And really, to judge them before they've had, I would say a full season, but certainly 3/4 of a season does seem a bit harsh. So I don't know. I honestly don't think any of them deserve to be booted. If I was looking at it and just, pure speculation of what might happen, I'd say, if Checo continues to struggle as much as he is, he may look at the situation, and if it kicks off between him and Verstappen at some point and there's internal wrangling, well, then Red Bull have this, very well packaged, as we were talking about, marketable drivers. Daniel Ricciardo sat on the sidelines waiting to come in. And, and that's the other question you have to ask. If you're going to replace a driver, certainly mid-season, you need a very, very good replacement, because coming into a car with zero testing and getting the job done is very, very difficult. So, for any team to do that, they need to know that they've got a driver waiting in the sidelines who's going to do a better job. And at the moment, I can't think of any current drivers in reserve roles who are going to do a better job than the drivers in the main seat. And I'd probably include Ricciardo in that as well, as much as I'd love to see Daniel back in the sport.
He's supposed to test drive the RB19, I think, after or during Silverstone, I believe is what he had told us when we were down in Miami. But gosh, I know Sergio has made some gaffes, certainly some frustrating gaffes, but he's still consistent. I can't imagine if you switched him out for Daniel Ricciardo, you'd be be getting better results from that second seat for Red Bull.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, Red Bull have said they think Ricciardo, since has been in the simulator again, has kind of rediscovered his mojo. That's what Horner said, I think, like almost word for word. And having spoken to Ricciardo, recently, I think it does seem like he feels that whatever bad habits he picked up at McLaren have gone. But that McLaren era was, it was so difficult seeing that. If you take Monza 2021 away, he really didn't impress at all. And I think it's such a risk to put him in that car because, you think you're not getting the Daniel Ricciardo of 2018 or 2014. I think you probably think you're getting the Ricciardo of the McLaren era. And as Perez is showing, I think being Max's teammate now is probably the most difficult job in Formula One. And if you're already struggling for confidence, I don't think you're going to find confidence against him because he's just going to be beating you most weekends quite comprehensively. So I think all of those things together, I think there'd still be a question mark around Ricciardo. But yeah, Perez is a weird one. I think, one or two good results and people stopped, will be fine again with him. But he comes to every weekend knowing that his best result should be his minimum should be a podium finish. Should be second place at this point, third maybe. So to not be finishing at least on the podium, it's a really, really bad result. So if that continues, if we get to the summer break and he's had a load more results like this, then I think that could be where we look at and start to think, is 2024 when he leaves? But yeah, to circle back to the original point, I don't know whether it would be an upgrade at this point to put Ricciardo in.
Well, obviously we don't have a race this weekend, so you guys have the weekend off, but then we turn our sights to Montreal, and just something to kind of keep an eye on. Wildfires are sweeping across the country. Quebec currently has 154 active fires. You see videos of a lot of smoke, visibility, air quality, certainly I don't think is at its best. What do we know? Will this be an impact possibly when we turn to next week, Laurence?
I don't think we do know at the moment. I think we're a bit too far out to determine what will happen with these forest fires, what the air quality will be like. All I can say is that this has happened before, and it was in Singapore. There was some mass forest fires in Indonesia at the time in 2019, and a lot of smoke and haze blew over into Singapore. And I remember getting off the plane and you couldn't see the tops of skyscrapers. The air quality was noticeably thick and rough and not very nice to be outside in. And and this was a couple of days out. The air quality on the pollutant standard index was hovering around 170, 180, which is considered very unhealthy. Now, I've just Googled Montreal and it's not that high at the moment. It's not even close to that. It's actually considered still very good. So a lot of this depends on which way the wind is blowing and atmospheric conditions and all sorts of things. But I remember talking to Dr. Luke Bennett, who used to work with a number of F1 teams and drivers at the time, about whether this haze that was in Singapore could put the race at risk. And he said, look, if there's any asthmatics or people with lung diseases or lung issues, then they should be very careful and they should not really be outside without a pretty serious mask because of the pollutants. But for the drivers driving round wearing a helmet and all the rest of it, there wasn't actually any significant danger whatsoever. And this was at a very high level of pollution. Now, whether F1 thinks it's suitable to race when there's forest fires in the area and potentially people's homes at risk, that is another question. I think then we fall back into the IMLA question. But at the moment, it's so hard to know where we're going to be in a week's time and what it's going to be like. But I think these suggestions that maybe the race will be called off because of the pollutant levels seems perhaps a little bit out of step, especially considering what happened in Singapore. And my other memory from that Singapore weekend is that it was particularly bad the Tuesday or Wednesday before the race. And by the time we got around to race day, it had all cleared up almost completely and no one was talking about it. So I think it's one of those things that F1 will obviously keep an eye on. I think it's an incredibly important issue for us to all consider, like the potential of forest fires and the impact they're having on the environment and how we can try and reduce that. But for F1 at the moment, I'm not sure it's something that they can really start to make a judgment call on next weekend's race. Yeah.
Nate, when are you supposed to head to Montreal?
I fly Tuesday. So, by Imola, I was waiting for the cab when the call came. But just to add to what Laurence said as well, one of the key things with Imola was that ultimately, I think from a look perspective, Formula One knew they couldn't go there in good conscience and race. But also one of the big things was the strain locally on the emergency services. And that, from everything I've read in Montreal, hasn't, because it's it's outside of Montreal, that's not an issue currently. The race going there wouldn't divert resources away. I think at Imola, there was just a whole concoction of things there. You'd suddenly have thousands of people basically moving into the middle of where this disaster zone was. Whereas here, I think obviously all the pollution stuff that Laurence has mentioned is important as well, but they'd be away from it wouldn't be like the Formula One races, like all these people converging around the wildfires like it was in Imola. So I think a very, very different situation. And I'd be surprised if it did lead to that. But Laurence is right, next week. I mean, if Imola's anything to go by, we'll find out 10 minutes before my cab arrives for this one. But yeah, I think it's one where, I'll dig out, the masks that we had from the pandemic and take one with me just to be safe. But I think the crazy thing is the images in New York right now. If it's anything like that, obviously by next week, then that will be a different story entirely.
Yeah, the videos and photos from New York right now are
crazy.
Really, really crazy. So something to keep an eye on for sure as we move forward. Something that hit the wires that I'm sure Lewis Hamilton is not going to be thrilled about is that the plans that we were hoping for to hold a South African Grand Prix in 2024, unfortunately have fallen through, which that would mean the Belgian Grand Prix at Spa will stay on the race calendar for at least another year. Is that the case?
Yeah, that's right. And it's been a strange one, the Kyalami Grand Prix plan. So Kyalami used to host, I think it hosted about 21 races between the late 60s and early 90s. And this has been in the news for a while now. Formula One really wants to go back to Africa, really wants to race there. But it's been clear that Kyalami really hasn't had the money to really put this event on. If you want a long-term deal in Formula One has to do the due diligence of making sure you can put that on. But even despite that, there was such goodwill on both sides to get it done. I think that there was you could almost kick the can down the road. The promoters changed last year. So a company called 777 took over the race. They're Miami based. So what has actually done this race isn't the funding. So I think that's an ongoing question. But of course, there was a report in Racing News 365 this week that the thing that's ultimately pushed that over the edge in terms of sidelining Kyalami, at least for the short term, is a much wider political question of South Africa itself as a country, very, very closely aligned at the moment with Russia. And obviously Russia at the moment with the invasion of Ukraine, that, let's not forget, led to the cancellation of the Russian Grand Prix, had huge implications on the grid as well. We had the Mazepins leave from Haas as well. So I think from that point of view, Formula One has looked at it and said, there's just not something we want to be involved in right now. That on top of the money issues have meant that that's just for the time being is sidelined. It's really interesting as well because Lewis has been a huge advocate, as you say, Katie, for this race. He said before he retires, he wants to race in Africa. And this looked like the easiest option to get a race there. It's kind of a circuit that's like ready-made there, has the history. I think one thing that a lot of more kind of long-term fans hate is that a lot of these new races coming in don't have that history. Kyalami ticked that box of, it might be a new, quote unquote, new venue, but it does have some Formula One history to it. The good news, obviously, from that perspective is, like you say, Spa stays on for another year. It's really sad because Spa just seems to be a matter of when, not if, that race gets canned completely. I love Spa; it's one of my favorite circuits, but there just never seems to be any desire from Formula One and Spa to kind of, for that to stay long term. From what I understand, there are a few options beyond Kyalami, like away from Kyalami, to fill that gap. So whenever somebody says there's new races coming onto the calendar, Spa is kind of the sacrificial lamb right now that gets circled and says, if we get this race on, that's probably the slot that goes, just because contractually they don't have anything in place. And I think that for whatever reason, Spa has kind of had a weird relationship with F1, even under Bernie. There was in the 2000s, I forget which year it was, but they had at least 1 or 2 years where they didn't race. So long-term future for Spa, not great, but this at least means they've probably got an extension for next season. And we often see that going back to a place to race is often enough to kind of generate some goodwill to keep it there, especially if you have a good race. So we'll see how that plays out. But yeah, for the time being, Belgium stays, Kyalami on the sidelines, but I imagine Kyalami will still kind of be in the mix at some point, but 2024 and 25 for Kyalami don't seem that likely.
So let me ask you guys this. Stefano Domenicali is reported to be working on a new F1 agreement. The proposals that have been rumored in said agreement, and I want you guys to debunk this if these are bloviated figures, but adding 2 more teams to the grid in the short term, increasing entry fees for new teams from 200 million to 1 billion, and increasing the number of races on the calendar. So let's hit that third point, if that is in case fact. If they increase the number of races on the calendar moving forward in this set agreement, could Spa then stay, or it's always going to be on the chopping block because they find value in other destinations?
Yeah, it's all about who's willing to pay and how much in Formula One. So at the moment, the limit on the amount of races they can have is 25, and that's under the current Concord Agreement. The Concord Agreement exists between the teams, the FIA and Formula One, and basically governs, or sets a basis to govern the sport, almost like a constitution. And there are certain things which are limited in it. One is the amount of races you can have at the moment. Now, Formula One have made it very clear that they want to expand the calendar, but there are a number of questions about that. Of course, more money is great for everyone in Formula One, because the teams will get a bit of that, and the FIA will get a bit of that. But the issue is, at what point are you potentially damaging the sport, or what point do you have oversaturation of races?
Yeah,
a lot of people in the sport are already talking about that, and rightly so. I think, if you look at a season like this where it's been dominated by one team and one driver, then we are very quickly going to lose narratives of what we're going to talk about midway through the season. There's not so much excitement midway through the season, even in a really competitive championship year. I feel like once you get to the middle of the year, you're so far away from the end of the year that you're like, well, it doesn't matter that much. You're so far away from the start of the year that some of the excitement has worn off. So I think there is a danger in having too many races. But yes, it could potentially mean somewhere like Spa has a stay of execution. They could be there longer because they are able to contribute something and add an extra race to the calendar, of course, along with being a fan favorite. But unless they can start to stump up the money to compete with new races coming in, then it's always going to be a question of who can pay us the most, and how many races in total can we have in, and keep everyone happy. And that's all stuff that will be thrashed out in the Concord Agreement, which apparently, negotiations are starting to get underway. It seems like a lot of the teams are quite willing to continue with something similar going forward, but F1 will of course be looking at how it can maximize revenues, and it's entitled to do that because it has to do that for its shareholders, for one, and and to become or to continue being a successful business, they have to look at how they can grow. And so one very obvious option is to add more races on, but whether it's a good thing for the sport is another question. And I think it would be really bad for F1 if we start losing some of the really great racetracks. If F1 is going to hold itself up as the pinnacle of motorsport, it needs to have the circuits to back it up. And I'm all for new tracks, places like Las Vegas and Miami coming in, but I'm yet to be convinced that any new circuit that has been added in probably even the last 20, 30 years can stand up to Spa as one of the greatest circuits in the world. Spa is that good, and having cars go around there, Formula One cars go around there annually, I think is very, very important for the health of the sport and the future of the sport, and keeping fans entertained.
Do you think that the second proposal alleged in this new F1 agreement, that entry fees for new teams would increase from 200 million to 1 billion, is in a realm of possibility?
So the figure I've heard, or certainly the figure that was going around earlier this year, was closer to 600 million. So 200 million is basically what you have to pay up front if you want to join the grid at the moment. That was based roughly on the price that Williams sold for several years ago. But it's now clear that Formula One teams are worth a bit more than that, because the valuation that Audi basically put on Sauber when they came in and invested in it was around 600 million. So, if you're making it cheaper for new teams to set themselves up and come in, then it is, the market value of the existing teams, then it's not good for the existing teams. So the teams want that number to be as high as possible, because it makes their franchise, their what they hold, become worth even more. And of course, there is this, the reason we have this anti-dilution fee, is what it's called, is because when a new Formula One team comes in, they are entitled to have a split of F1's revenues. And so almost as compensation to the existing teams, you have this entry fee, this anti-dilution fee, which gets split among the teams. And at the moment, when it was set at 200 million, maybe that was fair for what it was worth to be a Formula One team. Well, now everyone considers F1 to be even more popular, to have grown, and for the teams to be worth more than they were a few years ago. Well, it's kind of right that number goes up, but 1 billion does seem excessively high, because it creates such a high barrier for any new team to come in. And then, we really need to go back to the conversation of, is it beneficial for the sport to have extra teams? Are we better off having 10 locked-in teams that we know are financially healthy and stable? Or should we kind of open it up to more teams? Because it wasn't that long ago that we did have 12 teams in Formula One. 3 of them were just in a constant struggle for survival. And eventually all 3 of those teams went bust and dropped out of the sport. So I don't think that's particularly good for F1 either, because we're talking about a lot of people's jobs at stake and stuff like that. So as far as I'm concerned, the most important thing is that you have healthy teams. If you think the sport can only support 10 healthy teams, so be it. Let's work on that. And then if a new team does come in, they need to bring one, value in terms of who they are bringing in, but also some kind of anti-dilution fee to compensate the others. I do think there is an element of fairness to that.
I think what's commendable about F1 is that they are willing to evolve as needed. But Nate, do you think that there is a realm of possibility where they overstep, they overreach, and they go too far?
In terms of what they're doing right now, in terms of like going after some money in certain areas, do you mean?
Yes. Money, adding new teams, adding new races. Oversaturation was a word that Lawrence used. I don't want to say, are they too greedy, or are they just trying to capitalize on, the hotness of the sport right now? Yeah.
I mean, Michael Andretti, obviously, he called them greedy, didn't he, at the start of the year, and that goes right into what Lawrence was talking about the amount of money going around, and Formula One teams aren't convinced that he'd be a good, or his team would be a good addition to the grid for a lot of reasons. I think that you can look at this, and I think money at the moment seems to be dictating a lot of things in Formula One. Lawrence is absolutely right. I think if Spa went off the calendar, I think it would be crazy. But the fact that can't stump up the same money that, say, Qatar can or Saudi can, that if you're Formula One right now, you're looking at it and you can make more money right now than you ever could have done in Formula One. And it's funny, isn't it? Because that, as Lawrence said, that the idea of that being an anti-dilution fee, Formula One is happy when it comes to the calendar to dilute the product and say, well, we're going to have more and more races, more and more money coming in. I don't think the long-term future of the sport itself is being thought about. I think a lot of these decisions seem to be, we can make a lot of money right now with this race, with these teams coming in, whatever it is, and no one is really stopping to think at some point. And you could argue that the boom that we went through with Drive to Survive, there was clearly like a hockey stick style effect. I think it's very, very fair to argue, and very easy to argue, that at the very least that's tailing off at the moment. It might already be kind of tailing off, and I think it's tailing off from a very, very high point. But I think we've already started to see, if you actually dive into ratings at the moment, across the globe, they're really kind of dropping. And I think that's down to the season we're having. But I think that a lot of people don't maybe think that what Netflix sold them is what they're now seeing on TV, in terms of the sport they thought they were kind of getting into, maybe isn't the sport that they're seeing. So when that starts to happen, you have to think 5 years down the line. You can't think right now, where are we going to be? You've got to assume the worst. You've got to look at it and think, well, are we, I suppose, shooting ourselves in the foot right now? 5-10 years from now, are we going to regret some of these decisions that are being made? So I am a bit skeptical about some of the decisions that are being made. I think Domenicali's come in, and obviously, I think he's done a lot of things right, but you look on the commercial side of things, and I think if you're looking at the bottom line of these teams' budgets, there's nothing to be worried about. They're doing better than ever. But if you kind of step back and take a global look at things, I think Formula One's getting itself, maybe it's overstretching in a lot of places, and that never, doesn't matter what sport you are, that's never gone well for any championship or team or whatever. So I think that's a real thing we need to watch over the next kind of few years to see how that plays out.
Fair. I'll end Unlapped by painting a picture. Christian Horner, somewhat blonde, somewhat ginger, decent complexion, and a full navy getup. It complements said complexion. Now think of him in a full hot, passionate Ferrari red getup, head to toe. Is that a world you ever thought you would be living in? And I'm talking about Helmut Marko claiming that Ferrari tried to pull Christian Horner away for a lot of money to come be the team principal at Ferrari. Apparently the claim and the conversation went down at the Canadian Grand Prix in 2022. But can you imagine Christian Horner in all red?
I did wonder where you were going there with that, Katie, for a moment. But yeah, kind of.
Thought we were getting some fanfic kind of thing or something. But
did I paint a vivid picture, Laurence?
You certainly did. So you're right, though. Isn't that always the case? When someone who has been at a team in any sport for their whole career, as long as you've known them in that sport, it's very hard to imagine them going somewhere else. We had a similar thing with Lewis Hamilton just before he went to Mercedes. I mean, he actually didn't change the color of his race suit, but still, it was one of those things which no one could quite get their head around. Lewis Hamilton in a Mercedes, like what on earth? But with Christian, even more so, I think, and also because he is just so tied to everything that Red Bull is in Formula One. He has, of course, been there since day one. He was picked by Dietrich Mateschitz as the man that he wanted to lead his new team, this team based on a kind of new fun-loving way of looking at Formula One, but also deadly serious about winning championships. And he's everything about that. And for him to go to Ferrari would have been absolutely fascinating. I think it would have been a really great storyline for the sport. But I'm also not that surprised that it didn't happen. And for Christian, probably all it meant that in his next negotiations with Red Bull, he can add an extra 0 onto his contract, which I'm sure he's very happy about and will very willingly stay in the royal blue, would you call it? I don't know, navy blue of Red Bull.
Navy blue.
Ferrari's becoming quite a good negotiating tool for people, isn't it? Christian, Lewis maybe as well this year.
They're busy.
But sorry, lads, I didn't mean to cut. That was I cut you off mid Horner.
I mean, other than I'm not surprised he didn't go. I don't really have a huge amount to say for it, but I think it would have been brilliant to see what would have happened, because Christian is very good at what he does. He's a very shrewd political operator as well. So how that would have worked out behind the scenes at Ferrari, which we know is an intensely political team, would have been interesting. And I think perhaps good for the Scuderia, good for the racing team itself. But it didn't happen.
But it sounds like, just a quick one to finish, it does sound from what Marco said that he was close. Like it sounded like he, from Marco's point of view, you need to persuade him, which does remind you that whether you're a driver, a team boss, or a technical director, there is such sway in being the guy or being part of the team that wins Ferrari their first championship. I think in a few years' time, that's going to get bigger and bigger. And ultimately, if you're Ferrari, I think you lean into that as much as possible. You say, look, you come here, you win us a championship. Your Schumacher levels of, Schumacher, I think it had been 21 years when he won the championship since they'd won with Jody Scheckter. And that was, at the time, it was like, well, that's legendary status. So that must have been in Horner's head. You'd be forgiven for not thinking of the romanticism of that. So I think it'll be interesting. I don't know, when Horner's won a few more championships, whether he wants to stay in Formula One long term. I'm interested to see what happens in a few years where he can turn around and say, look, I've won a bunch of things with Red Bull. There's not, it's not like he'd have been leaving this team right before they won all these championships, which must be a really difficult thing to do, walking away when Red Bull's going to win a few championships. So in a few years' time, I'm not counting out Horner ending up there in a few years' time. It'd be a great place to finish your career and just give it a shot. I mean, why not? And if you're the team boss that does that, I think, a Christian Horner statue in Maranello would be a funny thing to imagine, but, not beyond the realms of possibility given where Ferrari is right now.
What a sport, what a world, oh, the possibilities. Remember, if you're watching on YouTube, like this video, leave us a comment, and don't forget to subscribe to ESPN for more F1 content. And if you're listening, hit us with a 5-star review wherever you get your podcasts. Have a great weekend, you two. Cheers.